benefits of the mining boom have been overstated. That's one of the central themes of a new book written by Reserve Bank board member John Edwards. He argues that the doom and gloom messages about the Australian economy are inconsistent with the country's bright future, such as the opportunities that present themselves in exporting goods and mostly services to the developing markets of Asia. John Edwards says that rather than having squandered the riches in revenue the government received during the mining boom, Australians saved a record amount. He writes that the debt and deficit we've racked up is a result of falling incomes, more than out of control government spending, and that both sides of politics don't want to admit that the real remedy will need to be higher taxes. John Edwards is the former chief economist at HSBC and was a senior economics advisor to Labor Prime Minister Paul Keating. As we mentioned, now he's serving on the RBA board. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Lowy Institute. He's the author of Beyond the Boom, a Lowy Institute booklet. John Edwards, welcome to Late Line.
Thank you, Emma.
Having read your book, one gets the distinct impression that the motivation in writing it was to somehow set the record straight, to celebrate our success and debunk contrary views on the current state of the Australian economy.
Yeah, well, I think that's exactly right. I'd heard for a while that the mining boom had been a huge event, but that we'd wasted it, we were feckless, we were complacent, but now the mining boom was over and we were in big trouble. So I wanted to see, are these propositions true? And when I looked at the numbers, I was quite surprised. The mining boom not as big as is widely believed, the income gain not nearly as big as widely believed, and of that income gain we saved a lot. Plus,
the
of course,
lot.
The lot. Plus we have hugely developed our capital stock, our human capital. So over that period, I think on the whole, the Australian economy and Australians performed quite well.
You go to great lengths in the book to explain that the debt and deficit position Australia currently finds itself in is not the result of Labor's profligate spending. If anyone is to blame, it's Peter Costello for putting personal income tax rates down.
Well, there's no doubt that to the extent we face a budget crisis, or faced a budget crisis, it's one about revenue. And that's apparent in the figures produced by this government, that of the increase of the return to surplus over the next 5 or 6 years, almost the entire amount is provided by increased revenue, mostly by increased income tax.
What you argue is that from the peak of the mining boom in 2003, the level of government revenue has fallen much faster than the growth in government spending. Is that generally the argument?
Yes. We got into deficit for two reasons. One is in the global financial crisis, we certainly increased spending at a colossal rate, but at the same time revenue collapsed. We then wound spending back, but revenue continued to be very, very weak, and that's why the deficit continued.
Yet the government's Commission of Audit found that if federal spending were to remain unchanged, by 2023 revenues would hit 25% of GDP, while spending would be closer to 27%.
Well, by 2025, budgets are always, every year the government looks at a budget that far out, it can see that a rising trend in spending which needs to be controlled. Well, it's one thing to say that if we don't control spending in a decade, spending is going to be too big. It's quite another to say that the reason we have a deficit today is because of high spending, if you see the distinction.
And what you're saying is that the reason we have big deficits now is not as a result of big spending?
Yeah, that's right. It may be that we would have, if you didn't do anything about spending, you might have a deficit in a decade, but that's a different issue.
In his speech to CEDA today, Prime Minister Tony Abbott made the point that in 2007 the government had a $20 billion surplus and $50 billion in the bank, and by 2013 we'd had six of the biggest deficits in the history of the country, despite the best terms of trade in our history. Did Labor, to any extent in your view, squander the riches from the mining boom?
I think you could almost say that the Prime Minister underestimates the expansion of those deficits. They were quite huge. They were quite extraordinary. Bigger than the deficits that we incurred, for example, in the Great Depression. Bigger than we've ever encountered. And yet over that whole period, we only had a couple of quarters of negative growth. And we know that other than that period in 2008-9 and the following year, when spending was expanded to mitigate the effect of the global financial crisis, other than that, spending then returned to the share of GDP it's been for most of the last 20 or 30 years. It follows that what was going on was on the revenue side. It was revenue.
You write that indeed the Abbott government's deficit levy on higher incomes is an explicit recognition that revenue is at the heart of the deficit problem.
That's true, but an even more explicit revenue is the numbers they produced in the budget, which show exactly that the return to surplus is brought about almost entirely by increased revenue.
So do you think that public messages that this government is giving are a little inconsistent with the reality behind their own numbers?
Well, I don't think they've hidden the numbers. They're out there. They're for people to see. I think Mr. Hoggie's been quite upfront about. They're in his own budget.
You describe the current economic policy conversation as disconnected from the reality of what Australia is and what it will become. What specifically are you referring to there?
Well, I think we do. Our narrative is one of failure. A predominant narrative about the Australian economy is one of failure, or if not failure now, then failure which will arise very soon. And that, I think, is an unreal account of the experience of Australia, particularly over the last 20 years, which have been ones of extraordinary success, both compared to our own experience and compared to that of other countries. So I think a narrative based on failure, a narrative based on the idea that we're about to collapse unless we do this or unless we do that, that we've been complacent and feckless, is not believable.
Why do we focus on failure, do you think? Pardon me.
Well, I think we've got into the habit of imagining that only an imminent crisis can motivate change. That this was a very successful tactic in the 80s, and we did effect some great reforms in the 80s which were necessary and that were motivated by the fact that we just couldn't continue the way we were going. But we're unwilling to recognise, I think, that we need a new kind of story.
Because you've written of participants in the economic debate using apocalyptic rhetoric and what you call declarations of a phony crisis to justify reform. Is that a criticism of the government?
I think it's a much more widespread criticism of the whole tendency of the Australian economic debate, that we typically propose that only the reform that we have in mind will save us from a catastrophe. This is the trope of the economic discourse.
The Abbott government's first budget promises significant cuts in spending to welfare, health, education and the university sector, but you seem to argue in your book that the case for such widespread reforms doesn't actually exist.
I wasn't speaking about those particular reforms.
You said things like, we complain of the proportion of the population on disability benefits, which indeed seems high at 6% of the population.
Yes.
But this is well below the rates of the US, the UK and the EU average. And
yes.
You also talk about the healthcare budget not being as out of control as is being told to us.
Well, in respect of healthcare, our healthcare spending is, it's below a number of comparable countries. It's about half the rate in the US. It's not out of control. It's a question of what we're prepared to pay for and the efficiency we can introduce into health spending.
Your prescription for improving the functioning of the Australian economy includes a focus on increasing labour force participation, among other groups, among women. You mentioned needed changes to childcare, affordability and access. Will the government's paid parental leave scheme encourage more women into the workforce, do you think?
To come back to the workforce, well, I think it could, but it's a very expensive way of doing it. And, I myself would prefer to see smaller benefits apply to more people.
In what way?
That, you could afford, for example, for the same amount of money to have improved childcare, and that would contribute, I think, more than the very high cost of paying a replacement wage.
One of the other areas where you say Australia needs to improve is our schools' performance. But you say we already know how to achieve better scores through the Gonski reforms. The government won't fund those reforms past the forward estimates. Why do you say they should?
Well, I certainly think we should. I think that's a very high priority for Australia. And the reason is that 3/4 of our kids perform extraordinarily well on international tests of reading and math and science, but 1/4 perform very, very poorly, and those 1/4 we know it's very highly correlated with their the income of their parents. So that we've got, if we want to improve those scores considerably, and we do, that's where we've got to make our investment, and that's exactly what the Gonski reforms propose, so I do think they're very important.
And have you mentioned your dismay about that to the government?
I haven't inquired.
But how important do you think that particular reform is for the future of the country? Because you seem to make quite an issue of it in the book.
Well, what I think, Emma, is that our future prosperity, our success as a nation, our continuing success as a nation is going to depend on our human capital, that is our education and skills of the workforce, of our children and children's children. And that means for our economic success, education is absolutely the key, education and training and repairing the deficiencies.
Do you think that the Australian public would rightly feel a little confused at the moment about all the conflicting messages they're getting about the state of the economy and what's required to repair the budget, given all the disparate voices and the current arguments within the Senate about various measures?
Well, I think people probably are confused, and of course this is the normal character of the political debate. We shouldn't be frightened of it. We're making important decisions about programs, but underneath it all, what we're really doing is increasing the share of tax in income. That's how we get back to surplus. So
are you saying that a lot of the measures that have been introduced in this last budget aren't necessary? Things like the Medicare co-payment, the deregulation of university fees and so on?
Well, I have a lot of reservations about Medicare co-payment. I do think it discourages people, particularly low-income people, from visiting a GP. But quite apart from that, we know that it's not contributing to reducing the deficit, of course, because it's all going into a fund for medical research.
We're out of time, unfortunately, John Edwards, but I thank you so much for coming in for us.
Thank you, Emma.
All the best.